And yeah, so we'll spend the next few classes on the urinary system, and then we'll move into the digestive system after that. And so, yeah, as we do kind of with any new system, we'll talk about some of the kind of fun facts surrounding the urinary system. The kidneys are the star organ of the urinary system. They do a lot. They filter. They pull 50 gallons of fluid out of our blood every day. That's what it means by filtered. But total amount of blood flow through our kidneys per day is 400 gallons of fluid goes through our kidneys per day. But of that 400, 50 gets pulled out. Okay. The full blood volume goes through our kidneys 12 times per hour. Okay. So our full blood volume of about 5 to 6 liters gets filtered through our kidneys 12 times every hour. Okay. And tons of little tubes. We're going to look at the names of all the little tubes today. If we put all those little tubes in a single file line next to each other, we've got about 140 miles of tubes in our kidneys. Okay. And the other amazing part about kidneys is that you can function with just one of them. Okay. That's why people can donate their kidney. But they actually do their job totally fine with no symptoms at all the way up until there's only about 25% of your kidney function left. Then you start noticing some symptoms. Oh. All right, so just a little bit of the functions of the kidneys overall, okay? So maintenance of fluid levels in the blood and the interstitial space, okay? That's gonna help us to maintain blood pressure and the correct osmotic / hydrostatic pressure in those spaces in our blood and in the interstitial space. Okay, so it's fluid levels in all of those spots. Okay, and then ion levels in the extracellular fluid. Okay, which includes the blood and the interstitial space. Okay, the main ions that are really important and that we talked about in this class: sodium, potassium, calcium, chloride. The kidneys are helpful and responsible for long-term acid-base balance. So our lungs help us to really quickly adjust acid-base balance, but the kidneys kind of have a longer-term effect. And so they do that by secreting and reabsorbing hydrogen ions or bicarbonate ions. Secreting means that we put that into the urine to get rid of. Reabsorbing means we pull it out of the urine to save it. They also produce hormones, the kidneys do. Erythropoietin, which is responsible for stimulating red blood cell production. And then renin, too. We've talked about both of these ones already. Okay, and then obviously what we think of with the urinary system is the last one, right? Excreting things, right? Excreting metabolic waste products and toxins. So nitrogenous waste products, the two big organic molecules we have in our body that are nitrogen based are proteins and nucleic acids. And so when we break those down, we have nitrogen we have to deal with. And and so we deal with that by turning it into ammonia. And so those two compounds, proteins and nucleic acids, we turn it into ammonia, convert that into urea. And that's one of the primary things we find in our urine is urea. And that's how we get rid of nitrogenous waste products that come from breaking down proteins and nucleic acids. Okay, so those are just kind of some general functions. We are going to spend most of today on like anatomy of the urinary system, okay, and some of that being the kidneys. We'll look at gross anatomy and microanatomy of the kidneys. But questions at all so far? Okay. All right, so kind of the big overview of more of what's called gross anatomy, things we can see with our eyes of the urinary system, right? So we've got the kidneys, okay? They're located in what's called the retroperitoneal cavity, which is like the back of our abdominal cavity, okay? And they're under muscles there. They're kind of somewhere between T11 and L2, okay? And they're protected by some of our lower ribs. We do have a little bit of our kidneys that stick out underneath our ribs, okay? boxers and MMA fighters tend to try to take advantage of that. If you watch any of that, they reach around behind someone's back and they're hitting them up underneath the ribs like that. They're literally trying to hit their kidneys to make them give up, but because it hurts, and then they end up having some damage. But there's a little bit that sticks out, right? They're mostly protected, but a little bit sticks out, and so their primary function of our kidneys is to produce urine. Okay, so we got the kidneys. Those are connected to the ureters. Okay, there's a ureter that comes out of each. This is just a tube to transport urine from the kidneys to the bladder. You guys saw these in the cats, most likely. Okay, and then we get to the bladder, the urinary bladder. It's just a big bag, right? It can stretch out, has some smooth muscle around it, so it can help squeeze out urine during urination. We'll talk about that process. But this is where urine is stored. We can't change it once urine gets into even the ureter and then to the bladder. It's not being modified at that point. It's just being stored for release later. And then the urethra is just connecting the bladder to the outside of the body. Okay, the next slide has some labeling you can do as well as a clicker question there. So I'll leave this up for a sec, but go ahead and flip to that next slide and start filling that in.
Because we were looking at C, and it's like,
Oh, yeah. It's a system we haven't got to yet.
something with, is it something with insulin? Or no, it's
No.
just something entirely different.
Part of your digestive tract.
Oh,
Yeah. Yeah. We almost hit all the systems, but not that one, yeah. All right, go ahead and send in your answer there in your clickers. Make sure to hit the send button. All right, I'll leave it open there for a sec. Looks like most of you have responded and everybody put F. Every single one of you, 100% put F. That's in the bladder, right? For sure. Okay. What'd you guys put for A? What'd you think that was? Adrenal gland. Got that. Okay. Also known as the suprarenal gland, right? Just sits on top of the kidneys, what it means. What about B? Aorta, yeah. Abdominal aorta, yeah. And then we got C, part of a system we haven't discussed yet. Any guesses on that one? Part of the digestive tract, that's the rectum. Okay. And then D, thoughts on that one? What did you think? Yeah, not everybody has one. Only females, yeah. But yes, that's the uterus. And I just think it's an interesting view to see like all those structures are right next to each other, right? You got the uterus, the bladder, the rectum, all right there, right? Um, so then when you think about pregnancy, right? And this uterus gets a lot bigger, right? Makes a lot less room for the bladder, for the rectum, for all of those things, right? So yeah. Okay, and then E is obviously the kidneys. Okay, F was the bladder, as most of you said, and then G would be the urethra, where that urine can be taken outside the body. So yeah, F was yeah, where urine is stored and no more modifications could be made, which is the bladder. Okay, questions on any of that anatomy there? Okay, all right. Well, let's talk a little bit more about the kidney then. A little bit more of the gross anatomy of the kidney. So the kidneys are surrounded with a tough fibrous capsule called the renal capsule, and it's there for protection, right? It gives it a tough outer layer that keeps it from getting split open, things like that, okay? The kidneys are also surrounded by fat called the renal fat pad, okay? That's been stained in green in that image, so you can kind of see that, okay? So just some cushioning for the kidneys. Okay, and then we got gross anatomy of the kidney itself. So there's kind of two layers of the kidneys. There's the outer layer called the renal cortex. That's the peripheral region. So on the outside. And within that, there's these renal columns that project medially towards the medial side of the kidney from the cortex. And then the deeper part, the inner part of the kidney is called the medulla. Okay, cone shaped, darker in color. And then we get to the renal sinus. And the renal sinus is like a little cavity inside the kidneys where where there's some fat, some connective tissue, where the renal pelvis is. Okay, so we'll see all of that, this and some more structures from the next slide in another image here in a sec. Okay, so we got the cortex and medulla, the renal sinus, and then the renal pelvis. The renal pelvis is channel that's within that renal sinus, but it's just kind of an open space where we're collecting the urine. Okay, so this is the passageway for the urine that's produced in the kidneys, and then it's going to connect directly to the ureter. Okay, and then there's these kind of funnels that make up the inner part of the kidney, which is where we're going to find all the functional little structures that we'll talk about in a second that help us make urine. And those are called major calyces. Okay, so there's 2 to 3 of these large funnels, and then each of those large ones are composed of 8 to 20 smaller little funnels called minor calyces. Okay, and the function of these is this is where all the urine collection happens. So it's kind of like funneling down smaller, smaller, smaller until it then just kind of drips into this renal pelvis area. And then the renal pelvis connects to the ureter to send that urine down to the bladder. On the outside of the kidney, there's a little indentation that we're all familiar with. When you see a kidney bean, right? It's in that same shape. It has that little indentation on it. That's just known as the hilum. Okay, so the indentation, but this is an entry point for the big arteries, the renal artery and the renal vein and the nerve as well. Okay, next slide is labeling of those things. So go ahead and you can start labeling that, and you can send in the answer to this up there on your clickers.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you got the fancy coffee in the dorm room, huh? Espresso, yeah. Living large, yeah. It's good stuff. All right, so you're sending in the answer there, which is the renal pelvis. All right, let's go ahead and come back together here. Looks like about half of you put F for your answer, and then about another quarter of you put H, and a few others. So let's walk through this together here. So the very first of all, that top one on A there, that's an external structure, right? That's just a little dent in the external part of the kidney, which is the hilum. The hilum is where all those different structures connect to. So where the ureter connects, where the renal artery or renal vein, renal nerves, where all of that connects. Okay. And then we've got the kind of regions of the kidney first, right? So the outer part is called what? What was B? Yeah, that's the cortex, and the inner part's the medulla, right? So we got the renal cortex, the renal medulla, and then we get into the little structures on the inside. Okay, so D is going to be one of those calyces, so a major calyx, which is just like a funnel. Okay, we got a few of those, just 2 to 3 of those, where all the little calyces connect to. Okay, but the main like kind of machinery of the kidneys are all found in this part, in the renal medulla and the renal cortex. And they're all in these kind of like pyramid shaped structures called papilla. Okay, so the papilla is just a little part that sticks out, okay, down towards the renal pelvis there. And then we've got F, which is the renal pelvis. So that was correct in that one. Okay, all of those are dumping into that. G, sorry, F there. And then G would be one of those minor calyces. That's a little minor calyce, connects to a major calyx. H is just the ureter again. All right. And then I would be one of those little pyramids in the medulla. And J is one of the columns. So renal columns that are kind of more rectangle-like. And then we have the pyramids that are a little bit more pyramid shaped, so just a little bit different. Okay. And then the very external part of the kidney, the tough part that helps protect it, is the capsule, the renal capsule, or the fibrous capsule on the outside. Okay, so the kind of the flow of urine production is the process starts way up here in the cortex. It's gonna make its way through the medulla. We'll see all the little microscopic structures here in a second that help us do that. And then it goes to a minor calyx, and then a major calyx, and then into the pelvis, and then into the ureter from there. Okay, bless you. All right, questions about any of this? Okay, so the kidneys are all about filtering our blood, right? So we have some very large blood vessels that come in and out of the kidney. Okay, and the big one that comes in is called the renal artery. Okay, it's a branch directly off the abdominal aorta. Okay, so it's very short because the aorta is right there, but then it's a really large diameter. Okay, so we talked about things that cause resistance to blood flow. One of those was length of a blood vessel. The other one is the diameter, right? So the shorter it is and the wider it is, that means it's going to have less resistance, right? So we can just send a lot of blood here really, really rapidly into the kidneys because it's so short and such a large diameter. Okay. The kidneys only represent about less than 0.4% of our body weight, but they get 20% of our blood flow at rest. Okay, it's about 1 liter per minute of our blood flow goes to 0.4% of our body weight, right? Because its main job is filtering the blood. Okay, we're going to talk about this thing for a while here, and I've helped you pronounce it here, but it's called the glomerulus. Okay, can you guys pronounce that with me? Glomerulus. Yeah, you literally just say air in the middle, right? Glomerulus, right? Yeah. Okay. And in the hospital and in your patients, you're going to see something called GFR someday. And that's your glomerular filtration rate. And we'll talk more about that coming up soon. So that's a very, very common thing that you'll talk about as a nurse or as a PA. Glomerular filtration rate. And the glomerulus is this special capillary bed, which is very leaky. And this is what does all that filtration we're talking about, right? That 50 gallons of fluid that gets pulled out of the blood every day from our kidneys, that happens in this really leaky, specialized capillary bed called the glomerulus. And so blood is sent into the glomerulus via an afferent arteriole. Okay, so a little arteriole that blood goes right into that glomerulus. And then it goes through this kind of knotted up looking section of capillaries. And once it makes it to the other side, then it connects to the efferent arteriole. And then that efferent arteriole is what takes that blood away and it goes back to the bloodstream there. Go ahead. Yeah. Yeah. So dialysis is doing what your kidneys are supposed to do, right? So when you're in kidney failure and your kidneys aren't filtering your blood anymore, then what dialysis is you connect the person's body and their bloodstream to a machine that gets their blood, goes through the machine, does all the filtering, takes the things out that your kidneys would, and then puts that blood back into your body filtered. So yeah, when your GFR gets too low, which just means your kidney function is really low, that glomerular filtration rate, when that gets really bad, then you start getting, your blood starts getting toxic, like all kinds of bad things happen because you're not clearing your blood of all the toxins. That's the kidney's job. And so you got to go on dialysis just to survive, which is just pretty much taking the place of the kidneys. Yeah. 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 Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, it ends up taking more of the load. Yeah, for sure. Yep. Yeah, because we're not really maxing out the workload that our kidneys could do normally when we have two fully functional kidneys. So then when one isn't working, yeah, then the other one just picks up the production a bit and does more of the work. Yeah. Yeah. Other questions about that? Yeah, so then we have two other special kind of vascular structures in our kidneys. One is called the vasorecta. Okay. We're going to talk about nephrons in a second, but nephrons are kind of the functional part of the kidneys, all these little tubes that includes the glomerulus that does all the filtering for us. Okay. So we have the vasorecta that are around the longer nephrons, and we have another set of capillaries called the paratubular capillaries, which wrap around our shorter nephrons. Okay. And the function of these is to help us bring that anything that got into the urine that we didn't want to lose. We pull that back and it's got to enter the bloodstream some way. So it enters through these capillary beds. And then that last one just says a renal vein um, and the function of that, which I'll read to you guys so you know you can't see it in the back, just says returns blood to the inferior vena cava, right? So that's how we get blood back into the general circulation is through that renal vein. So renal artery, sends blood into the kidneys. Renal vein is letting that blood go back to general circulation after it's passed through all the different tubes along the way. Returns blood to inferior vena cava. Okay. So this is just kind of what that looks like. These are those steps there, right? So we can see those big blood vessels coming into the kidneys there, right? So we see that big renal artery dumping blood in. Okay. That blood is gonna make its way all the way up through through this smaller artery. And then that connects it to a bunch of those afferent arterioles, which are going to connect to those glomeruli. Okay. And we can see that afferent arteriole here. Okay. So now we're kind of zooming in on one spot. So here's the big arteriole that we might see here. That branches off into a little afferent arteriole. Then this is the glomerulus here. So that's one of those glomeruli. That's what C was. That's where the filtration happens. So blood goes in there at high pressure and a lot of fluid squeezes out of that. And then it gets caught, gets picked up by this capsule here. And we'll talk about that part here in a sec. And then the blood that doesn't get squeezed out, that makes it through, is going to end up hitting this other arteriole here, which is the efferent arteriole. All right. And then this is the whole tubular system of the kidney, all this yellow part, and the blood vessels wrapping around that part would either be the paratubular capillaries or the vasa recta, depending on which part of the kidneys and which part of the nephron we're talking about. Okay, so then you can see after we go through all that capillary bed, then we end up back here at a little venule. Okay, and then that venule, we're gonna have a bunch of those venules that are all gonna dump into the renal vein. And then that renal vein is gonna send the blood back to our general circulation. So that's just kind of the basic pathway of blood flow through the kidneys. Okay, questions on that? Go ahead, Colby. Yeah, so the vasa recta is it's this capillary bed here. We'll talk a lot more about it, but as this is called the filtrate, this is what makes our urine, the stuff in these yellow tubes. As that filtrate is passing through, there's certain things we want to bring back from it, like some glucose gets in there, some sodium gets in there, a lot of water gets in there that we don't want to lose. So we pull those things out of this yellow part. We're going to pick it up somehow to get it back into the blood. So that's what the vasa recta does for us. It picks that stuff up. So then we can take it back to the regular circulation. Yeah, good question. Other questions? Okay, so this is looking at kind of a bigger view of all of those structures we just talked about, plus all the little tubular structures. Okay, and so when we think of the word nephron, a nephron is this whole structure here. Okay, so it includes all these little tubular things along with the glomerulus. Okay, and you can see we have two different types of nephrons in our kidneys. Okay, one of them is called a cortical nephron. A cortical nephron has a much shorter loop part to it. It doesn't stick down as far. Okay, and then we have a juxtamedullary nephron. Juxta just means next to. Medullary means medulla, right? Cortical means cortex, right? So the cortical nephrons are mostly in the cortex because this is the junction between the cortex. So this will be all cortex up here. This will be all medulla down here, right? So juxtamedullary nephrons are the ones that are closer to the medulla, whereas the cortical ones are up higher, mostly in the cortex. Okay, so we have these two different types of nephrons. Most of them, 85% of them, are the cortical ones, right? So we have lots more of those cortical ones and just a few of those juxtamedullary ones. Okay, so as you're just looking at it, you can see some differences, right? One difference we already said, which was the length of the loop part. That's called the nephron loop or the loop of Henle. Okay, and so that's one of the differences, is that we've got a lot longer loop with those juxtamedullary ones. Okay, so that's oops, sorry, that is nephron length is the difference there, okay? The other part is that the glomerulus is just a lot closer to the medulla with these juxtamedullary ones, where with the cortical ones, it's up higher, okay? And then we only have vasorecta in those juxtamedullary ones, in the ones with the real long nephron loops of Henle that stick way deep into the medulla. That's where we have that special capillary bed, the vasorecta around them. And we don't have that in these shorter little cortical nephrons. This image doesn't show it very well, but we do actually have, this is called the paratubular capillaries, the ones that are wrapping around the other part. We actually do have that in both types of nephrons, even though this image doesn't show it that way. Okay. Questions on that so far? All right, well, we're going to dive in a little bit deeper to the nephron, and we'll kind of name all those little structures, all the little parts of the tubular system. And then next class, we'll spend all the time talking about what those actually do and how we produce urine. Okay, so the nephron, this is where the filtration happens. This is where we produce and concentrate our urine. And this is the site of exchange between our blood and our urine. So things we want to get rid of, we use the nephron to help us do that. Things we don't want to get rid of, we want to pull back that got into the urine initially, then we do that here in the nephron as well. We have about 1.3 million of these little nephrons in each of our kidneys. So somewhere around 2.5 million of these nephrons exist. Okay, so tiny little microscopic structures. Okay, but this is what does all the work of the kidneys. Okay, so we had the glomerulus, right? That was part of the vascular system. That was a capillary bed. But we talked about how the fluid, bless you, leaks out of that glomerulus, and then it's surrounded by a capsule that picks up that stuff that leaks out. That's called Bowman's capsule. Okay, oops, that's not what we meant to do. That's called Bowman's capsule. Okay, so this is where the start of urine production happens. Okay, so Bowman's capsules first, also known as a glomerular capsule. And then the first part of the kind of real tubular part we get to is called the proximal tubule, also known as a proximal convoluted tubule, or the PCT. Okay, function of this is the major site of reabsorption, meaning that we're pulling a bunch of stuff back. So we just filtered a ton of fluid and everything that was in that fluid into the urine, pretty much. And we call it filtrate at that point. But we've kind of put it outside the body once it gets in those tubes and it's on its way out. Okay, but there's a lot that we don't want to lose, because obviously we don't lose 50 gallons of fluid every day, right? So the vast majority of all that comes back into our bloodstream. It's 50 gallons gets pulled out, but almost all of that comes back. Most of that reabsorption happens right away in this first step in the proximal tubule. Then we get down to the loop of Henle. This is that hairpin loop, goes down then back up. Okay, the function here, well, first of all, we have an ascending part and a descending part. Function here is kind of to temporarily concentrate the filtrate. We'll talk more about why next time. But what that does is it sets up a concentration gradient deep in the medulla of the kidneys. So we can use a highly concentrated interstitial space later to pull a bunch of fluid out of our urine right before it exits the body. That'll make more sense next time, because we're not really going into those details yet. But yeah, it says temporarily sets up concentration gradient in interstitial space. Okay, so we've got Bowman's capsule, proximal tubule, loop of Henle, and we'll have two more structures here in a sec. Everybody got this? Okay, then we've got after the loop of Henle, we get to the distal convoluted tubule. Okay, the function of this is kind of, think of this as sort of fine tuning the urine. Okay, so varied levels of secretion and reabsorption depending on the body's needs. So we might add some more waste products to the urine here if we need to, or we might pull some more stuff back, some more sodium back if we need to at this point. Okay, so that's the distal convoluted tubule. Right in this area is a special structure called the juxtaglomerular apparatus. okay, or the JGA, you can call it. The JGA is the junction of a Bowman's capsule, distal tubule, and the little arterioles we talked about before, okay? And this is kind of like a monitoring area for the kidneys, okay? The kidneys are responsible for monitoring our blood pressure, making sure we have the right level of fluid and ions in our blood, and measuring, yeah, the actual amount of ions in our fluid. Okay, so we have two special cells that do this for us. The granular cells actually have mechanoreceptors on them, and they're measuring blood pressure for us constantly, right? So measuring the pressure of fluid going into our kidneys. And this is where renin comes from, right? We talked about renin before. And so when these sense low blood pressure, then we know we better start holding on to more fluid. One way to do that is to release renin, because remember, renin leads to the production of angiotensin 2. Angiotensin 2 helps us hold on to fluid, raises our blood pressure, all of that, right? So it's all stemming from these granular cells here in the kidneys. And then we have these other cells that we call the macula densa cells. And those ones are lining the walls of the distal tubule. And their function is, instead of mechanoreceptors, they're chemoreceptors. So they're measuring the amount of sodium in the fluid. And that's going to help us fine tune the amount of sodium that we release into the urine and the amount of sodium we pull back to save. Okay, so we went distal tubule. This is kind of not necessarily part of the step-by-step tubular part, but it's a collection of different parts, the juxtaglomerular apparatus. But we went from distal tubule, and then that connects directly to the collecting duct next. This is a bunch of distal tubules collect to the connect to the collecting duct. And this is what it's eventually going to empty into the renal pelvis and then drop into the ureter from there. So there's those structures. Go ahead and label those structures there and send in the answer to that question on your clickers.
Yeah, I just don't. Probably. Yeah. Yeah. No, like he was like looking at the names and like
A lot of new words today. It's a vocab day for sure. All right, so go ahead and send in your answer to that question there. All right, make sure to hit send. Okay, so about 80% of you are saying C for the answer there. So where's the major site of reabsorption? What is that structure called in C? Proximal tubule. Yep, got it. Okay, well, let's start with A though. So A is the place that collects the filtrate. Okay, the stuff that's filtered, that's the glomerular capsule or Bowman's capsule. Okay, and then we got the capillary bed on the inside. That's the glomerulus. C, as you guys just said, is a proximal tubule. So that's the first place it gets to. And as it's passing through there, most of the water and all the stuff in it is brought back to the blood at that point. So we get most of it back. So it's about 65% of it all comes back right away. Okay, but then the filtrate is going to make its way down into this descending part of the loop of Henle. Okay, or the nephron loop. So we got the descending part, goes down, loops back around, comes back up through the ascending part of the loop of Henle, or the nephron loop, and then that connects directly to the distal convoluted tubule there in E. That's where we kind of fine tune the urine, pull some things out, add some things we might need to. And then finally, we get a bunch of distal tubules that connect into a single collecting duct there, which is what F is. Okay, you'll see that if you go back to slide 11, it's not this way, actually. The distal tubule is actually over here. Right? You see what I'm talking about? It's not laid out that way. This image just makes it look like that to make it a little bit simpler, but it's actually like that. That one's not so simple. But this one's a little bit easier to look at. We go proximal tubule, loop of Henle, distal tubule, right? So it's actually on the other side of the glomerulus, instead of the way that shows it there. Just this one just lines it up that way, so it makes it a little bit easier. Okay, questions on that one? Okay, so then we've got this special structure, the juxtaglomerular apparatus. Okay, this has some other structures that we were just talking about. What I want you guys to do for a sec is, which of the areas is it the one that measures blood pressure? Okay, you've got the letters there for that, and then which one monitors solute concentration? And then for the clicker question here, where in the nephron is the macula densa, right? So which part of that there, and you can use the numbers there for your answer on the clickers, but go ahead and answer the other two questions as well with the letters just on your paper, but the one on your clickers, you're going to send in that number. So go ahead and just talk through that, get your orientation there. Tired too. Yeah, sure. Post lunch. Yeah, didn't do it. All right, so you're sending in a number there. Go ahead and hit the send button after you get that number to the one you want it to be. All right, I'll leave it open for a second, but most of you are putting in 4, the distal tubule, which is correct. Which area measures blood pressure? Which letter did you say there? E, so the granular cells, right? And that's coming in the afferent arteriole, right? So this is the glomerulus, right? It's that specialized capillary bed, and then it's surrounded by Bowman's capsule, right? And then we get right into the proximal tubule right after that, right? So blood's rushing in this way in that afferent arteriole. So these cells on the outside here are little pressure sensors, right? They're sensing how hard that blood's coming in, right? If there's not enough pressure sensed on those, then we got too low a pressure, and these cells actually start releasing renin into the blood. So then that renin is going to go and have all those effects that we talked about. Okay, so blood goes in here, gets filtered, the filtrate goes that way, blood exits via the efferent arteriole, right? So we've got blood pressure being monitored there in E, and then which letter there for the solute concentration? A, yeah, those macula densa cells. And again, this is the distal tubule, right, that comes up right next to this area, and those specialized cells there with chemoreceptors sensing how much sodium is in the fluid. Okay. Questions about all this? Okay. So then lastly here, this is an interesting image because it mixes microscopic anatomy with gross anatomy, right? So we're looking at the cortex of the kidney here, medulla of the kidney there, getting down into the renal pelvis, right? The major calyx, that's where the fluid's gonna go, right? These nephrons are much smaller than that, right? But this just kind of gives you a nice little image so you can see where each thing is in location to each other, right? So the structures that we just talked about that actually are in the cortex are there, right? So the Bowman's capsule in all the nephrons, proximal and distal tubules, right? And then the very top or the start of the collecting duct. I'm just going by this image right here, right? You can see most of that stuff right up here. This line here is the cortex medulla kind of border there, that dotted line. Okay, which things are in the medulla? Right, the loop of Henle sticks way down into the medulla. And then most of the collecting duct, and you can see that collecting duct, those collecting ducts are long, right? They go way down, all the way down into the bottom of those little pyramids that we were talking about before, right? And then those are going to dump into the minor calyx there. Okay, so then if we put the full pathway together of filtrate and urine, all that's starting in Bowman's capsule, goes the proximal tubule, loop of Henle, distal tubule, collecting duct, and then we can connect the other pathway we had before with the gross anatomy, right? So it's the minor calyx, major calyx, renal pelvis, ureter, down towards the bladder. Okay, I'll leave that up there. But this is really just an introduction to all the structures, all the anatomy here. And then again, next class, we'll dive into the function of all of these things and how our urine is produced. So I'll leave it there. Have a great rest of your day, guys.